If you love my barely prepared content here, then you'll love my completely unprepared content on my streaming channel, which is youtube.com/grimstreams, which is pretty easy to remember. Hello lovelies, today we're going to take a look at Warlock, Traitor Edition. This is a small, independent, old schoolish RPG intended to emulate the state of British role-playing in the, I would say, mid through to late 80s. It exists somewhere between fighting fantasy, Warhammer, and Dragon Warriors, leaning much more heavily on the Warhammer side, I would say, but mechanically with some similarities with fighting fantasy. It's a small, sort of A5-ish format book. I plumped for the hardcover because why not? This is the Traitor's edition. It's pretty basic, but also pretty good, I would say, all in all. So it's not as simple as fighting fantasy. It's not as complicated as Warhammer. And it's not as innovative as Dragon Warriors was, and in some ways still is. I think it does successfully emulate the feel of British role-playing, British game publishing, and so on in the time period that it aims for. It's a little different to what you might expect, and it seems to have arrived just in time, considering my previous video about how the OSR needs to be more than just endless versions of D&D, because this is kind of tailor-made for that. So your characters do not have statistics, per se. Instead, much like fighting fantasy, you have skill, stamina, and luck. You know, that's kind of taken directly from fighting fantasy. Even the amount is, broadly speaking, the same. You get slightly more luck by 1 point. Stamina is the same as in normal fighting fantasy. But your skill isn't a single stat. It's a bunch of different skills for all sorts of things. Adventuring skills. In a similar way to the way in which Warhammer hybridizes skills and stats. Because in your stat block you have weapon skill, ballistic skill, so on. As well as strength and toughness and so on. You don't get the strength and toughness exactly, but you do get a bunch of different skills. And stamina, which is essentially your hit points, and luck, which is how lucky you are. Rolls are made using a d20. You roll a d20, you add the appropriate number, you try to get over 20. If you're against something static, you might get a penalty. You might get a bonus if something's easy, or in a contested roll you both roll and it's the difference. Either way. You can play things other than humans, but it doesn't particularly seem to make any difference to things. Instead of being a generic adventurer, as you would be in fighting fantasy, you have different careers, and different careers have different access to different skills, and you can progress between the different careers much in the same way that you could in classic Warhammer fantasy roleplay. So you can progress and advance in a particular career. Each career is defined by its own career skill, which is an average of its sub-skills, and you'll have to progress through different careers to get access to different skills, which is great. I've always liked that about Warhammer. It makes sense to have it here. Works fine. So some examples of skills. As adventuring skills, appraise for appraising items, athletics for general athletic capability, bargain, blunt weapons, bow, brawling, command, crossbow, the usual kind of stuff. Fairly broad skills. Career examples: agitator, which is basically a rip-off of Warhammer, beggar, boatman, bodyguard, and it would be easy to add new careers, new skills if you wanted to open it out or customize this. I don't think this is open license. No, it's not, which is a shame, because it would be nice to produce stuff for this game. Of course, there's nothing to stop you doing that if you have a magazine or something. That's a separate rant for another time. But yeah, there's a good selection here. One thing I did notice, though, was that to get to the advanced careers that you have later on, you have to have progressed through a couple of previous careers. But there's really only a couple of magic using careers. I think it's cleric and initiate and wizard's apprentice. So if you want to be really good at magic, ideally you should have 2 careers at least for each of those, like wizard's apprentice and alchemist, initiate and zealot or something, so that you could concentrate on your magic casting careers without having to compromise with a secondary career. Just a small thing, but slightly annoying. There's traits, but I couldn't, in 2 read-throughs, I haven't found out what traits actually do other than describe your character. But I suppose where it applies, you could provide a bonus or a penalty. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them could be taken either way. I don't know. Maybe it's just a quick way to describe your character, but if it has a mechanical influence, then like the different races, it doesn't particularly seem to make much difference there. Equipment's fairly simple, costs are fairly simple. There's not a lot of background, which can be good. It's kind of implied background that you can learn and make up as you go along, which fits with fighting fantasy until they codified it in Titan and Out of the Pit. Yeah, it hits all the right marks, and canny people will notice that a skill of 6, which is a typical starting skill, ends up being about the same percentage chance of success as you would have with starting Warhammer characters. It doesn't feel the same though, because it's a D20 basis, and advances and increases in skill feel bigger and better because it's essentially 5% at a time. So it doesn't feel quite as whiffy as low-level Warhammer Fantasy role-playing can be. Combat's pretty basic. Initiative is more important. If you steal the initiative and initiate the attack, then you get a bonus to your attack, which is a good way of making initiative, speed, ambushes and that sort of thing count a bit more. Essentially, you get a +5 bonus to your attack if you're the one being the aggressor, which is quite nice. No objections to that. Armor reduces damage rather than making you harder to hit. Different weapons do different amounts of damage, obviously. You can score critical hits. You can score mighty blows if you get more than 3 times what the person rolls for their defense. You essentially do double damage. Once you're reduced to 0 hit points and below, then you start taking critical hits, which is similar to my game Blood. And the more damage you take, the more serious they get, and until they become, you're knocked out or dead. Which is nice, but you don't have a lot of options for doing cool things in combat, like leg sweeps or grappling, or I'm finding that's a common complaint that I have with a lot of games now, is that you're not encouraged to do cool things, to consider combat maneuvers. You just kind of roll for an attack. But again, that's a rant for another time, or something to address in my own game design. But it just becomes more and more obvious that this is a lack, that this is something that is boring in a lot of standard game design, particularly old school stuff. And that's always been one of my objections to things like Dungeons and Dragons. But with critical hits and mighty blows and things, and stealing initiative and ambushes and so on, it's a bit better in this. Magic is pretty simple, showing from its roots in the kind of Warhammer and fighting fantasy basis. You can miscast your spells and it can go horribly wrong and mutate you and so on, which is nice to have, and again fits into that old Warhammer channeling the warp sort of idea as well. So it's a lot of basic spells, and it's pretty easy to come up with them. Magic items are largely discouraged, and they mostly tend to have spell effects, so that's quite simple, rather than giving you bonuses and things. We have a fairly nice bestiary, but I think they kind of missed a bit of a trick when it comes to the Bestiary. I mean, you've got all your basics, and you know they have special abilities and so on to distinguish them from each other, but it would have been really nice if it had been cross-compatible with Fighting Fantasy. But as things stand, their skills tend to be, in combat, tend to be higher, and their stamina tends to be much higher, and there doesn't seem to be an easy and obvious mathematical way to convert the one to the other. Let's take goblins for example. So goblins, weapon, skill 6, I think that's what that means on this. Goblins in Death Trap Dungeon, for example, have a skill of 5 rather than 6, and stamina here is 10, and they had a stamina of around 5 in that. So, and if you look at the Manticore as well, yeah, it's got skill 11 in Death Trap Dungeon, if I remember right, whereas here it's got a skill of 9, and it had a stamina of 11 in Death Trap Dungeon, while it has a stamina of 40 here. So as you can see, there's no real easy, obvious way to convert the one to the other, and that feels like a little bit of an oversight or mistake. It's unfortunate, because there's a whole bunch of material you can rip off, but fair enough, you can't expect every game to be cross-compatible. It's just that whole skill, stamina, luck thing lulled me into a sense of thinking that I could maybe use my old Out of the Pit book or set it on Titan or whatever else without too much trouble, and that wasn't really the case. Games Master advice is scant, it's all pretty basic, but it's good enough, you know, it does the trick, does what it says on the tin. Character sheet's a bit crowded, there we go. In terms of layout, it's all pretty basic and reminiscent of the old games that it's basing itself on, so that's all good, particularly Fighting Fantasy and particularly Warhammer, probably leaning more towards Warhammer. The artwork is a kind of slightly naive, old school style, lots of pointillism, you know, pen and ink sort of work, which again is reminiscent of the right things. So that works for me, even if it is a bit naive and a bit crude here and there. It certainly hits the nostalgia buttons. Whether that will appeal to new players, I don't know. But for me, it takes me back to the days of Fighting Fantasy, Dragon Warriors, Warhammer, White Dwarf before it was a catalogue, and even the old Choose Your Own Adventure magazines like Proteus and so on, which I still have a copy of somewhere. So yeah, what can we say to sum up about this then? Reasonable value for money, maybe a little bit expensive on the print on demand from Drive-Thru, which is where I got it. In terms of style, it's very evocative of the period, it's very nostalgic. The slight amateurishness of it might put a few people off in terms of presentation, but for me, who as a British role player of a certain age, this is probably the target market of, I would say 4 out of 5 for style. In terms of substance, you got everything there that you need, and the absence of a setting, or large absence of a setting, is a feature rather than a bug. It's got everything you need. I do wish it had that cross compatibility to make it easy to rip shit off. And it might have been nice to have, I don't normally say this, but it might have been nice to have a tiny little introductory adventure or an encounter or something to go on to show how they intend the game to be played. Also, some things aren't particularly well explained, so substance, still going to give it about a 4. It does what it sets out to do, and it does it pretty well. So that's a total of 4 out of 5, 8 out of 10. Recommended. Pick up Warlock Traitor's Edition if you want a window into what role-playing games in the UK used to be like, what the presentation and the art used to be like, what the look and feel used to be like. It's a good way of looking back without having to hunt down the old materials on eBay. Zang.
Aren't you a little tired of so-called horror media about shiny, sparkly, angsty, whiny monsters? I know I am, and that's why I created Actual Fucking Monsters, where you will play an actual fucking monster doing horrible and monstrous things and being tracked down and killed for it. Buy now at DriveThruRPG, post-mort.com or lulu.com.